Hi, I'm Michael Appel for BizNews.com. Coalitions, the advent of these new inventions, well, not exactly entirely new inventions, but new in a broader sense. They came into being in a much bigger role in following the 2021 local government elections. That saw the ANC lose its majority in many metros across the country as it dipped under 50% for the first time. And that's a feat likely to be repeated in the 2024 national elections. To shoot the breeze and unpack some of what's going on in coalitions following a very interesting article that he wrote recently, Nicholas Woode-Smith is an author, political analyst, and economic historian from Cape Town. Nick, we were saying you had day zero where I'm reporting from. We have our own problems. Haven't had water for 3 days. The city of Joburg is going through, as the younger generation will say, the most at the moment. And there's like Twitter wars going on between the speaker and the mayor and let's call them former coalition partners. I want to focus on your recent opinion piece you wrote. Unlikely to be popular, but that's not why people write things. Let's start there, actually. The ANC-DA coalition prospect. Were you asking the question, or do you think it would actually be a good idea?
So there's a lot to unpack there. So it's asking the question, the main thing. But when all this coalition stuff was starting, I was cautiously optimistic. I've always actually been a little bit of a champion for the little guy. I liked small parties. Even when I was quite a big DA supporter, even when I was a card-carrying DA member, which is no longer, I supported small parties. I thought they were good for the hygiene of a democratic system. I thought they were good for providing diversity in ideology and opinions. And also, I'm a free marketer, so I like competition. I think it incentivizes parties to do better. But the way that small parties have behaved in these local coalitions this year, especially in Johannesburg, has been absolutely dismal and abysmal. And it's very disappointing. And it's kind of, with the developments in the ANC, especially with Thabo Mbeki returning to the fold, and with a lot of people in the ANC realizing that things can't actually continue like this, they're losing the control over the throne. They're realizing that their Cold War era ideology is starting to become really outdated. And they realize, and even the corrupt are realizing you can't steal if there's nothing to steal. I think that they are, and the ANC is a big party, so I'm starting to think that there's going to be factions involved that can actually be worked with. And I think that a coalition with one of those factions could actually be very valuable. It could usher this faction and the ANC as a whole in the right direction. And if anything, and it is always a risky prospect, as some of the better comments said, because obviously the majority of comments are always going to be people who haven't actually read the article. But there is always the risk that the good party, so the DA in this prospect, instead of being able to be a nice guide to, handhold the ANC and brings them into the light, instead just going to be pulled into the pits and become just as depraved as the people they're trying to save. That's always a possibility. So this has to be, there has to be a hang of a lot of strong willpower. There has to be a lot of confidence. There has to be a lot of intelligence and firmness. And also, there needs to be, and I think I wrote an article about this a while back, where it might be more prudent to just let some coalitions fall. This was actually, especially speaking about ActionSA, because ActionSA does not want to cooperate with the DA. I've thought that maybe there might be possibilities, but I do not think that, as it stands, the current leadership of ActionSA wants to work with the DA. I think that there's two possibilities: a personal vendetta, which I think is very likely, especially seeing how many members of ActionSA are ex-DA supporters, ex-DA members. And also seeing how the party was founded, as effectively Herman Mashaba, DA mayor in exile, starts a party that effectively has only two real platforms, which is let's stick it to the DA because we're better than them, and xenophobia. It's not really the and they play lip service to the free market stuff, which always draws me in. Whenever I see some of the tweets that are like pro-business or anti-communism, collectivism, I'm always like, oh no, those guys could be good blokes, and then I remember what they're actually doing and where what they're doing in practicality rather than just playing lip service for. But I digress. I think that back to the ANC-DA and the possibility, it's hard. But politics is always hard and politics is always confusing. I think that if you went back a century and you asked someone the possibility of there being a multiracial, multi-party democracy now, so a lot of people would be like, what are you talking about? And so there's always these possibilities. And I think that, especially with the world where there is right now, if you follow geopolitics, we're going into a really weird, wacky world order. And I think that, so what if we could get a competent ANC with being handheld by the DA? I think it is a possibility.
You know, was it Helen Ziller who once was said to have broached the subject, the possibility of it, but was kind of put to the sword? There's this notion of permanent friends and permanent enemies in politics, and we know that that's not true. So just to circle back, you believe that there is a competent, efficient, progressive faction part of the ANC that would potentially maybe one day be willing to work with the DA. And I wrote in my context to your article that the idea behind an ANC-DA coalition would be to remove the instability, because you would have a 40-something party with a 20-something party. You're well over the 50% mark. When you have an issue or a disagreement on policy or whatever, you thrash it out between yourselves. There's not somebody who can withdraw. Sure, you can, but then the entire thing collapses. But there isn't a tiny one-seater party that is going, if I do not get my way, I'm voting a different way and collapsing this whole thing. So these two, well, the main party and the main opposition party actually coming together in a well-structured coalition that explicitly spells out exactly which positions go to whom based on the percentage that was received by each party, that creates a semblance of stability, does it not?
Oh, definitely. So also I want to go back to what you said about the Helen Ziller broaching the subject. It's quite funny how she did so. So allegedly it came out that she just mentioned it at a bar. So she just effectively, I think it was after some conference, and just talking about the possibility as if it was just some sort of vague theoretical thing. It wasn't ever something that was brought up formally, but then Herman Mashaba wrote that hit piece on her and brought it into the light. There was Twitter wars and all that. And I found it deeply ironic that while doing so, ActionSA has constantly formally broached the possibility of going to coalition with the ANC, while also in practicality handing power to the ANC repeatedly through sabotaging the coalitions. So now back to your question, I agree with you completely. It brings that stability. It removes a space for opportunists to literally try to be kingmakers, where someone who represents one seat of the vote, I don't even want to calculate how many voters that would actually be, can end up ruining it for 99% of the voters. And it's a dreadful system. I've written in quite a few of my articles that a lot of these parties act like they're representing the constituencies and representing the city of Johannesburg, but they're really not. They are a minority party that represents a smidgen of the people in our democratic system, but they act as if they are the majority stakeholders. That is the problem with the kingmaker mentality. And that's why it would actually be better if the kingmaker, in the sense, would be the 20% party, as you said, rather than a 1% party. And this is a far cry from what I used to believe. I used to be I want a coalition of dozens of parties, but maybe our politicians in South Africa are just not mature enough for that yet.
Yeah, that was my next question. And I've asked it to a lot of the politicians across the spectrum. Do we simply just not have the political maturity for this sort of a system to work, similar to what you have in many other countries around the world, but you would have parliament stocked with the highest percentage one political party on its own would get is like max of 20, and then it's just building, and whoever can get across 50 plus one. But those are highly regulated, and those coalitions seem to work. They do work in many countries. But do we just not have that political maturity because we haven't had to have it? The ANC's become, it was a juggernaut, and very slowly, democracy has eaten that elephant one bite at a time. And we simply don't have that maturity. And the biggest party in the country at the moment doesn't know what to do, doesn't know how to deal with this new status that it has.
I think that the big thing which I've realized more and more from reading history is that, like people, countries mature with actual age. Not just countries, institutions, societies, some religions, to be honest, actually. If you look at Judaism and how people who follow Judaism and how they tend to act, and also there's a maturity there that reveals how old that religion actually is. Countries like England are very ancient. People don't realize how old their parliament is. And the building itself is old, not to mention the institution. And there's something in there that leads to some sort of collective maturity, collective spirit and knowledge that makes things like that stable. Europe has had a lot of time to iron out the kinks out of its democratic processes. We can see the problem with its coalitions and the instability of its government during the Weimar Republic and the rise of the Nazi Party. They learned, and they learned the hard way. We could learn from them, but I think the problem is people don't like learning from other people. People want to make mistakes themselves, and so do countries. So I think South Africa, we have a lot of learning to do in many cases. And the big thing is we need to learn to crawl before we can walk and before we can sprint. And the problem is especially in Africa, especially in a lot of these third world countries, we want to start learning to sprint full speed before we can even get the basics right. And so we want to set up an advanced multi-party democracy before we even know what actually allows democracies to be successful, which is property rights, controversially, I'd say gun rights as well, but that goes into a huge amount of. In fact, if I may digress, because it is, I can actually take it quite short. Historically, there's two very successful republics, and there's the American Republic, the early American Republic. I would argue still the modern one, but a lot of people disagree with me there. Maybe as a South African, I look at what's happening in America and they're talking about their oncoming civil war, and I say, you privileged bastards. And then also the Serene Republic of Venice, which is something that many more people probably haven't heard about. There were two things that made those republics so stable and so successful. One, the people who were voting had skin in the game. So they either owned property, which means that they had a physical stake in the country that was being voted on, or the actual wealth and success of the country was inherent to their wealth. So in Venice, it was merchant families who were voting. So if Venice does well, they get to make more money. So if Venice does badly, they lose money, they lose property, all that. In America, they own property. If there's laws get passed which hurt the country, they're losing physical stake in their economy. And now gun rights, it's not just gun rights, it's basic. It can also be a lot of economic wealth. It can be basically any sort of hard power that actually backs up that vote. Because a vote is worth nothing if you can't actually back it up. If an entire population, puts in their ballots and then the incumbent president says, well, no, I'm not stepping down, then the democracy is worth nothing. In the American Republic, they all had guns. So if the president refused to step down, they go and they overthrow him. In the Republic of Venice, every single voting family had their own army. So they were able. So the Doge could never actually become corrupt or become a totalitarian dictator. There was also a hang of a lot of other checks and balances that made sure that the Doge It's something that I think we should actually do now. I think just if anyone's interested, follow the Venice's political system. I think it would be excellent now. When we could even apply it to a democracy where everyone's allowed to vote as well. I think that the checks and balances they put on the ruling executive is just excellent. We should do that. So South Africa doesn't have that. So South Africa's still, its property rights are terrible. We still have huge amounts of population living in effectively the descendants of the apartheid homelands. Just grand apartheid still functionally exists. We removed petty apartheid but kept the actual definition of it. So they're not able to actually gain any semblance of skin in the game. We've got people who I'm going to add education to this as well, but I really hate using education as a magical bullet because what are you going to teach the person? It depends on what you teach them, and I don't trust the people in charge at the moment to teach the right stuff. But they don't understand how the political system works, so how are they going to actually be able to vote for the right party? I saw a good post on Facebook which was saying that voting should be considered public transport. It should be the most convenient and best bus for you. It's not a permanent marriage. But the problem is in South Africa, it's considered a permanent marriage. And now a lot of people are going through a very brutal divorce.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And I mean, you should be able to vote. We are, because of the history of this country, the ANC still has that loyalty, that absolute love, where people would rather choose not to vote than to vote for anybody else. So when, as you say, they have either had a big fight as a community or a province with the ANC, they will abstain. They will stay away from the polls. They don't necessarily give their vote to anybody else, but that's also changing. The younger generation that comes in owes no loyalty, feels that it owes zero loyalty to the ANC. Gen Z, they really don't care about your struggle credentials. And that's a factor that is so prevalent still. If you look at the ANC leadership race now, you've got some younger guys and girls coming in, but it's still very much that older generation that's clinging. I want to ask about what happened in Ekurhuleni recently. Tania Campbell is booted out by the EFF abstaining, and that allowed the motion of no confidence to succeed. Then, a couple of weeks later, Tania Campbell is now back in office because the ANC and the EFF openly, those two were speaking to each other, and they were deciding now which party is going to get the mayoral chain. And the EFF wanted it. It's the smaller party, but it wanted it. And I just want to read a tweet from Floyd Shivambu. He's the deputy president of the EFF. And it says, ANC self-seeking opportunists sabotaged a solid and sound agreement reached after open and candid discussions based on logic. They approached us, agreed with us, and then reneged due to the center that doesn't hold. The EFF never sacrificed principles on the altar of political convenience. What do you make of that?
I think he's just doing damage control for his voters, to be honest. I think that what's happened here is extremely good, not just if you're a DA supporter, but because an unholy alliance between the EFF and the ANC would be disastrous for South Africans. I spoke earlier about how we want the DA to be in coalition with the ANC, mostly to be a good influence on them, to try to usher them into the light of good ideology and good governance. The EFF would be the little devil on their shoulder, but not even a little devil. It would be a huge devil crushing their shoulder underneath the weight. There are a bunch of existing factions in the ANC. I do not know if one of them is actually pragmatic or efficient or has a good ideology yet. I think it's possible, but I don't know yet. What I do know is that one of the factions that exists is still that old school communist, SACP supporting labor unionist party. And they're actually possibly more dangerous than the corrupt faction in my mind. I would actually rather have the Zuma faction than them, because I think at least the Zuma faction, they want money to steal, so they'll at least allow policies that will allow the money to be produced in the first place. The problem with let's call them left-wing faction, is that their ideologies will destroy this country. And the EFF support those ideologies. So an unholy alliance between the two, where the EFF pushes for those ideologies to be supported, would be absolutely disastrous for the entire country. So I like that the negotiations fell through. I like the instability that it caused, especially because it ushered in a little bit of stability afterwards with the incumbent mayor returning. I do not think that the negotiations fell down due to anything to do with ideology or to do with the cravenness of the ANC. I think that the EFF was not as keen as they claimed to actually gain the mayorship, because the EFF knows, so for all their bad ideology and all their ignorance there, the EFF knows that they're not actually good at governing. The EFF does not have a cohort of bureaucrats like the DA does. It doesn't have a cohort of people who think they're bureaucrats like the ANC does. They are a bunch of effectively university graduates who have political science degrees, who have all these lofty ideas and carry around Fanon and all that. And I think they know that. I think that they know that they're not actually going to be able to govern an area, and that it's just going to be an anchor to them where they're going to have to behave themselves. They're going to actually have to do a real job, because there's a very big difference between being a parliamentarian and being someone in local government. One is actually a job. And it's a job that even the anarchist in me kind of has to accept. Is going to exist. And the EFF, they probably know that they're not going to be able to handle that. So, and if they do, they're going to screw up the job, and they're going to act, and it's going to be some ammunition that can be used against them. So I think they sabotage themselves. I don't think that they wanted to be the mayor. And I think that on the other side, I think the ANC is starting to think, okay, maybe we shouldn't trust these guys. Oh, and to add, the EFF may also be realizing that there might be a danger. And this actually goes back to, why should the DA go into coalition with the ANC? The EFF may be asking itself, why should we go into coalition with a ship that's rapidly going down, and we might get dragged down with it? And the question there is then, okay, well, if the EFF doesn't even want to touch the ANC, why should the DA? And I'd say because the DA may very well have lifeboats.
Yes, I think the one thing that the EFF likes more than anything else is sticking it to the man. Now, whether the man is the ANC or the DA or the Freedom Front Plus or whoever it is, they like the politics of spectacle, and they're very good at it. They're experts at it. And it's always been, and what you're saying about Ekurhuleni, it's one thing to say you want the job. It's another thing to do it. And 18 months or 17 months away from a national election in 2024, the EFF has never managed anything. So this may be the very first time that the South African population gets to look at them in the electorate and goes, well, you stuffed up Ekurhuleni, good and proper. So it may be that you're right, they don't want that responsibility so close to a national election. And I know we say so close, but I mean, it is relatively. People are going to remember what you do now. Exactly. They're going to remember what you do now ahead of a national election. And they may be happy being the perpetual opposition party that always pines for leadership but doesn't actually want it.
Because that's how they keep their cushy legislator jobs. Because they're a legislative party. They don't have the expertise to be in the executive, but they've got the spectacle and they've got the big words to be able to be parliamentarians.
Yes. I don't know if you saw, the South African Human Rights Commission has come out to instruct Julius Malema to retract and apologize for insightful and hateful comments that he made in the Western Cape recently, saying revolutionaries, it's your duty to kill, and a revolutionary must never be afraid to kill, and so on. I don't know if you saw that.
I didn't see it, but it just sounds like more of the same. It all just blends into one. It's also with there's been so many ANC supporters who also go out and say similar things. The EFF basically has the entire platform built on, let's just call it what it is, hate speech, that vague term that doesn't really sound what it is. This is what happens when a ruling party is actually a revolutionary organization. This is what happens when you have a party that's entire founding principles was based on destroying something else. And not to say that the thing they need to destroy it is bad that they destroyed it. It's good that they destroyed it. It's good to have revolutionary organizations in some times. The problem is that an ideal revolutionary organization would tear down the oppressor and then step back to allow a good civil service to take its place. That's not what the ANC did. The ANC tore down the oppressor and then decided to try to replace the oppressor with the same people who don't know anything about oppressing. Well, that's the bad part, but about governing. And that's the EFF is basically a splinter of the ANC, and it is an undiluted part of that revolutionary spirit, that thing that they just want to destroy for destruction's sake, for revolution's sake. And I think that I always laugh at these things when they try to demand apologies for the hate speech and stuff, because of the nature of South Africa. They're not really going to arrest the person for inciting violence, where that should kind of be what it is, because it's conspiracy to commit murder, just vaguely. But so they demand an apology, but then, like, so what? Who are you apologizing to? It's always just a petty political lip service that's slightly amusing and often irritating.
Yeah, and I don't know what the equality. They probably, on principle, I don't know, but I suspect, looking at his track record, Mr. Malema will not apologize, and he will take his chances in the equality court, because that is the sanction. Then they will be dragging him to the equality court to prosecute him if he doesn't apologize and retract. So we'll see how that works out. But I mean, after their recent court victory, where kill a farmer, kill a boer, was not ruled hate speech, one has to ask the question how much further you need to go to be found guilty of something. So that's interesting. My last question to you, Nicholas, 2024. The ANC is nervous. The ANC's own literature from their National Policy Conference said that they are likely to dip under 50%. So I don't think it's going to come as a massive surprise to them. How do you see 2024 playing out? And just how well or how badly do you think the ANC is going to do? A lot hinges here on the ANC.
And that's the thing. It depends on who their presidential candidate becomes. Depends what happens with Ramaphosa. Depends what happens with the Mbeki faction, the Zuma factions. I think, in general, what I believe, I think the DA is going to recover a little bit. I think the DA is, after its house cleaning, after it's purged a lot of its bad blood with the ActionSA exodus, and also after it realized and became a little bit more aware of its own ideology, because it had that confusing phase with beforehand, where it kind of lost track of who they really are. I think they've been doing a relatively good job returning to their older roots, being confident, but I think they're going to recover a little bit, but they're not going to go past that. That's just my gut. EFF, I think, is going to hit a little bit of a block. I think that they've reached critical mass for their for what they can do, appeal to South African voter base. ANC definitely is going to lose out regardless. I think it just matters of how much they lose out. I think if the Zuma faction gets back in charge, I think they're going to lose out a hang of a lot. I think if Ramaphosa stays, they're going to lose a little bit. I think that the best thing for them would be to let Mbeki back in. I think people have forgotten a lot about the bad stuff Mbeki did, and I think they only really remember the good stuff, and I'm kind of guilty of that as well. We always pine for the presence of our youth, don't we? And I think that it's going to be... Now, also the main question is the ANC actually going to start rigging things? My gut's telling me no, but you never know. And so they're good friends with Zimbabwe and the PRC, so they definitely have the ability to do so. I think it's up in the air for the moment. I think a lot of things hinge on what does ActionSA do? Does ActionSA upgrade itself from just a petty anti-DA party? Because they will reach a limit of how many votes they can get purely trying to poach from the DA. If Herman Mashaba actually just suddenly takes a U-turn and decides, hey, I'm going to stop attacking the DA. I'm going to become a presidential candidate who's going to start poaching ANC supporters because ActionSA effectively is not actually like the DA. They're more, if anything, a more conservative, more openly xenophobic version of the ANC. And they could work with that. So I think that if ActionSA starts targeting ANC voter bases, they will gain a lot and they will take a huge chunk from the ANC. I don't know if they will be competent enough to do that. I think a lot of the smaller parties, some of them are going to start losing support, depending on if the voters are paying attention. They seldom are, so maybe they might not. But overall, it depends on how the coalition is going to look. Now, I'm not sure if the DA and the ANC are going to go into coalition. I think there is a distinct possibility, especially if you look at the media, not just my article, it's coming up more and more. People talk about the possibility. And I don't think there's going to be that the ANC is going to lose enough that there's going to be space for small parties to form a coalition. And if they are, I don't think that will be stable. I don't think there's enough goodwill among the smaller political parties for them to form a national coalition. I wish there was, but I don't think there is.
So hypothetically, you would have Ramaphosa, if Pala doesn't slay him in the meantime. You would have Ramaphosa 2024, and after this meeting of minds between the ANC and the DA, hypothetically, everybody relax. You would then have Steenhuisen as a deputy president, and then based on the percentage of votes that the ANC garnered and the ANC garnered, or the DA garnered and the ANC garnered, you would then create a cabinet on a particular proportional representation between the parties. Is that kind of how you see it going?
I think in essence, I think it would mostly be to do with backroom deals. It would be more who can force what. Hopefully the useful cabinets would be put in charge of the DA, and then the useless ones, which most of them, can all be given to the ANC. And hopefully the ANC will be willing to do that. I don't think the ANC would give up policing, which is sad because that's actually that's the cabinet that needs to, that's the position that needs to be given up. That's the portfolio that needs to be put in charge by the DA. I think that, it would be most of the stuff that happens in politics is done in the halls outside the parliament, outside the union, inside the union building with the dim lights. So we never really know what's going on unless you're there. I don't think it's going to be as formal as assigning, divvying us out on a proportional basis, though.
Yeah. Good chatting. Nicholas Woode-Smith, thanks so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. Cheers.